Today we're looking at a story that shows how one question at a wedding can unravel an entire lie. A man watches from across the ocean as his ex-wife's perfect day becomes a public reckoning. Here's what happened when the truth got a microphone. I stopped loving my wife the second she screamed at me about napkins in front of 20 dinner guests. Not because of the napkins themselves, but because of what I saw in her eyes when she did it. Absolute certainty that I deserved to be humiliated, that my existence was something she had to manage and correct. 6 months later, I was signing divorce papers in a lawyer's conference room in downtown Denver. Each of us with our own attorney, her reapplying lipstick between pages like she was getting ready for a photo shoot instead of ending a marriage. 14 months after that, I was sitting in a cafe in Lisbon watching the light change over the Tagus River, and my phone lit up with a message from Derek Miles, my old college buddy who still lived in Denver and saw everything on Instagram. The message was short, but it hit like a punch. Vanessa's getting married in 3 weeks, Napa Valley, some vineyard called Seven Hills Estate. I stared at that message for a long time because the timeline didn't make sense until it did, and then I remembered the business trips, the late meetings, the way she'd started dressing differently about 8 months before I filed. But here's the thing, I didn't feel angry. I felt something way more useful. I felt curious. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without context. Vanessa and I met in Chicago 15 years ago at some charity gala neither of us wanted to attend. She was in luxury real estate, I was in private equity, and we looked perfect on paper. For the first 3 years, we probably were perfect, or at least functional. Then we moved to Denver for my job, bought a house in Cherry Creek that she immediately started renovating. And that's when I started noticing the pattern. Nothing I did was ever quite right. The furniture I picked was trying too hard. The restaurants I chose were obvious. My suggestions for spontaneous weekend trips got treated like I'd proposed setting money on fire. I'm not saying I was innocent. I worked long hours. I got distant. I stopped trying to win arguments I knew I'd lose. But somewhere in year 8, I realized I'd started sleeping in my office twice a week just to avoid the feeling of walking into my own house. We had 2 kids, and they split exactly down the middle in a way that broke my heart. Nora was 13 when I left, and she'd already figured out her mother's game. Would watch Vanessa critique everything from my shirt choices to how I loaded the dishwasher and roll her eyes in this tiny gesture of solidarity that made me want to protect her from the cynicism she was learning too young. Then there was Ethan, who was 11 and completely Team Vanessa, parroting everything she said about how I was cold and didn't care enough and embarrassed her. I couldn't blame him. When you're 11 and your mom is magnetic and certain about everything, you believe her. Vanessa had this way of rewriting history in real time, telling people I forgot our anniversary when I'd actually planned a dinner she'd canceled, mentioning my anger issues at parties when I'd never raised my voice once in our entire marriage. The truth didn't matter. The story mattered. Have you ever lived with someone who controlled the narrative so completely that you started doubting your own memory? The napkin incident was at a dinner party she'd insisted on hosting even though I'd worked a 16-hour day and told her I needed to sleep. She'd hired a catering team, rented specific glassware, created a seating chart like it was a state dinner. I was exhausted and trying to help, so I set out the napkins, the expensive linen ones she'd bought from some boutique in Boulder. Apparently, I folded them wrong. She walked into the dining room, saw them, and her face did this thing it always did right before she decided to make an example of me. Her voice cut through every conversation in the room. 20 people stopped talking, and she performed her exasperation and disbelief like she was on stage, turning to her friend Rachel with this look that said, "Can you believe I have to deal with this?" I stood there holding a napkin, and something in me just switched off. Not in an angry way, in a final way. I looked at her and thought, I don't love you anymore. Just like that, clean and permanent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just walked upstairs, took off my jacket, and started planning my exit. It took 6 months of quiet, deliberate preparation. I worked with a lawyer Vanessa didn't know, a guy named Walter Griffin who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and understood that revenge is a dish best served cold and legal. We moved money carefully, restructured assets, created trusts for the kids that she couldn't touch. The house, the cars, the furniture. I let her keep all of it. Sounds generous, right? Except Walter had refinanced everything into her name 6 weeks before I filed, tied to loans with balloon payments she didn't understand and credit lines she'd maxed without realizing. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to escape without her destroying me first. The day I told her I wanted a divorce, she laughed. Actually laughed. Told me I wouldn't survive without her like it was a fact, like I was some kind of incomplete person who needed her to function. I didn't argue with that either. I just handed her the papers. The divorce was fast because I didn't fight her on anything visible. She got the house. I got my freedom. She told everyone I'd abandoned my family. I moved to Lisbon on a D7 visa, found an apartment in Alfama, and didn't correct the narrative. Nora texted me every day. Ethan stopped speaking to me entirely. I saw a cardiologist in Lisbon who told me my blood pressure had dropped 30 points since leaving Denver, that I'd probably added 10 years to my life just by walking away. Vanessa moved on faster than I expected. Within 4 months of the divorce being finalized, she was posting photos with Kenneth Bradshaw, some commercial developer who looked like he'd stepped out of a Brooks Brothers catalog. They were everywhere together, charity events and ski trips and restaurants with wine lists longer than most books. She looked happy in a way that felt aggressive, like she was proving something to an audience I was no longer part of. Looking back now, the red flags were everywhere. The speed, the performance, the way Kenneth's smile never quite reached his eyes. But Vanessa had always preferred a good story to an inconvenient truth. Then Derek's message landed in my phone, and I found myself thinking about Seven Hills Estate. I'd been there once, years ago, for a corporate retreat. The venue was famous for its architecture, some acoustic design feature where sound carried in weird ways, where conversations on one side of the terrace could be heard perfectly on the other if you knew where to stand. I remembered the event coordinator mentioning it, half joking about how couples should be careful what they whispered during ceremonies. I sat in that Lisbon cafe, watching people live their small real lives, and I thought about Vanessa in Napa, performing happiness for 300 witnesses. I wasn't going to go to the wedding. That would have been pathetic, but I wanted it to be memorable. I wanted one person to stand up and say one true thing, just to see what would happen when the story she'd built met reality. So I made a phone call to Graham Witherby, an old client who owed me a favor and knew how to move through wealthy circles without raising suspicion. I asked him to get himself added to the guest list. Vanessa's wedding planner was someone who valued connections over verification, and I asked him to prepare a toast. Not cruel, not obvious, just honest enough to let the cracks show. Then I sat back and waited, because the thing about Vanessa was that she'd built her whole life on a foundation that couldn't handle questions. And I was about to introduce questions she couldn't answer. Notice the pattern here. He didn't fight back with anger, he fought back with strategy. The real mistake was ignoring years of emotional abuse because he wanted to believe the performance was real. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away and let someone's choices catch up with them. Graham called me 3 days after I sent him the details, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something's harder than expected. He'd gotten himself on the guest list by mentioning the Copper Ridge development deal. Apparently, Kenneth had been name-dropping that project for months to anyone who'd listen. Graham figured he could position himself to give a toast by approaching the wedding coordinator during cocktail hour, offering to say a few words as a family friend from the Colorado development community. Weddings that size always had people volunteering speeches, and coordinators rarely said no to someone who sounded legitimate. He asked if I was sure about this, told me that once he said what I wanted him to say, there'd be no walking it back. I told him I wasn't asking him to lie, just to ask questions, and he said that was exactly what made it dangerous. Nora reached out 2 days later through Instagram, which was how we communicated now because Vanessa monitored her regular messages. She sent me a photo from Vanessa's feed, Kenneth and Vanessa at some wine tasting in Sonoma, his hand on her waist, her smile so bright it looked like it hurt. Then Nora sent 3 words that made my stomach drop. She told me she'd been doing research on Kenneth because something about him felt off, the way he talked about money, the way he never gave straight answers about his projects. She'd found legal forum posts from investors in Phoenix asking about Kenneth's development company, mentions of delayed payments and permits that never came through, and a pattern that looked like a shell game. She said a lawsuit was coming, maybe more than one, that she thought he'd been moving money around to stay ahead of it. When I asked how she knew all this, she told me she'd called one of the Phoenix investors pretending to be a journalism student doing a project on real estate development. 14 years old and already better at investigation than most adults. I felt proud and terrified at the same time. Then she told me the part that made everything worse. Ethan had moved in with Vanessa and Kenneth full-time, convinced that I'd abandoned the family and that Kenneth was a real father figure. She said Ethan worshipped Kenneth, talked about him like he was some kind of hero, but she'd been watching Kenneth at dinner and he didn't even look at Ethan when he talked, just performed for Vanessa while Ethan sat there like a prop in someone else's show. She told me she was coming to the wedding not to celebrate, but to document. She'd booked a flight using money she'd saved, told Vanessa she was staying with a friend that weekend, planned to record everything in case something happened. I told her to be careful, that I didn't want her in the middle of whatever was about to happen, and she said it was too late, that this was her family too. Ethan called me 4 days before the wedding, and I barely recognized his voice. 12 years old, but trying to sound grown, cold in a way that sounded exactly like Vanessa. He said his mom told him to call and let me know he wasn't interested in a relationship anymore, that I'd left and chosen myself over family, that Kenneth said a man doesn't run from responsibility. I let him finish, didn't interrupt, and then I asked him one question about Kenneth's last business partner and what happened there. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he asked what I was talking about, and I told him I wasn't going to poison his mind with accusations, but I wanted him to do something for me at the wedding. Watch what people don't say. Watch who asks Kenneth about his work and how he answers. Watch his mom's face when someone congratulates her on the timeline. He told me I was pathetic, trying to ruin their happiness because I couldn't handle my own failure. Then he hung up. I sat there in my apartment in Lisbon looking at the river, thinking about all the ways you can lose a child without them dying. The rehearsal dinner happened on Friday night, and Nora sent me updates like she was filing reports from a war zone. Vanessa was shaking, trying to hide it, but her hands kept moving. Kenneth told a story about acquiring a property in Scottsdale, and 3 people at the table pulled out their phones right there. Ethan gave a toast about new beginnings and how Kenneth showed him what strength looks like, didn't mention me once. Graham showed up and introduced himself as a family friend from the Colorado development scene, and everyone bought it, though Kenneth looked nervous for about 2 seconds before recovering. Nora said the guy was good at performing. I told her to be careful, and she reminded me she was already in the middle of this, that it was her family too. The night before the wedding, Graham sent me a voice memo. I listened to it on my terrace while the sun set over Alfama, his voice steady and certain. He drafted the toast to sound like advice from an old friend, stuff about foundations, and making sure the structure can hold the weight and transparency in partnerships. He'd mention me in passing, make it sound generous so no one would suspect, then pivot to questions, not accusations, just questions. How did Kenneth close 3 dealerships in 18 months when the market was down? Why did his credit lines get restructured right before the engagement? What happened to the investors in Copper Ridge now that the permits were delayed? He told me the thing about questions was that innocent people answer them easily, while guilty people get defensive, and Vanessa was going to hear those questions in front of everyone she was trying to impress and realize she didn't know the answers. I told him he could still back out, and he laughed, said he'd sat through 100 weddings where everyone pretended everything was perfect while the foundation rotted underneath, that someone should tell the truth for once. Then he asked what I thought would happen after, and I told him honestly, I didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe Vanessa would laugh it off and Kenneth would charm his way through and life would go on. Or maybe the questions would sit there like termites eating away at the fantasy until the whole thing collapsed. Either way, I told him I wasn't there and I wasn't part of it. I was just the guy who gave reality a microphone. Nora's last message came at 11 p.m. Napa time, 2 a.m. for me, asking if tomorrow was going to be chaos. I wrote back that tomorrow the truth gets to speak as loud as the performance, that after that people can decide what they want to believe. Then I added that she should stay safe, record everything, and remember she was the smartest person in that room. She sent back a heart emoji, and I sat there in the dark wondering if I'd just protected my kids or put them in the blast radius. The thing about truth is that it doesn't care about your intentions. It just detonates, and everyone nearby feels the shrapnel. Here's the lesson. A 14-year-old did more due diligence than any adult at that wedding because she valued truth over comfort. How many disasters happen because people choose to stay silent rather than ask uncomfortable questions? Sometimes protecting your kids means teaching them to see reality clearly, even when it's painful. The wedding was exactly what I expected, perfect in that aggressive way Vanessa always demanded, where every detail screamed money and taste, and look at what I built. Nora sent me photos throughout the morning showing the vineyard at Seven Hills Estate with rows of vines going golden in September light, white chairs arranged in perfect curves, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Vanessa in her dress, this fitted ivory thing that looked like it came from a Milan runway. Kenneth in a custom suit, his smile wide and confident like a man who'd never been questioned about anything in his life. The guests arrived in their Range Rovers and Teslas, women in pastel dresses, and men in expensive casual wear that said I'm rich enough to underdress. Everyone performed their roles perfectly. The emotional hugs, the champagne toasts during cocktail hour, the way people kept saying finally, and so happy for you like Vanessa had been waiting her whole life for this instead of divorced 8 months ago. The ceremony was short and generic. Some officiant talking about partnership and trust and building a life together. Words that sounded meaningful until you remembered Kenneth was facing investor lawsuits and Vanessa had no idea. Ethan stood next to Kenneth as a groomsman, chest out, trying to look like a man, and it broke something in me to see him there believing in this. Nora sat in the back row with her phone positioned carefully, recording everything like she'd promised. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception terrace, this massive stone patio that overlooked the valley, and that's when I remembered what the event coordinator had told me years ago about the acoustics. How sound traveled in strange patterns, how the architecture created these invisible channels where voices carried across distances they shouldn't. Vanessa and Kenneth did their first dance to some Ed Sheeran song, and people watched like it meant something, like love was a performance you could purchase with the right venue and the right lighting. Dinner was served, some five-course situation with wine pairings, and then the toast started. Vanessa's business partner went first, talking about her drive and her vision and her ability to create beauty, which was true if you ignored everything it cost. Kenneth's brother spoke next, some generic speech about family and loyalty that sounded like he'd copied it from a wedding website. Then Ethan stood up, and Nora's camera focused on him, his face serious and rehearsed. I listened through Nora's live audio feed from 7,000 miles away, heard my 12-year-old son describe Kenneth as someone who doesn't run when things get hard, who shows up, who builds instead of destroys. He never said my name, but everyone knew who he meant. Vanessa cried these delicate tears that didn't mess up her makeup, and Kenneth put his hand over his heart like he was genuinely moved. The audience applauded, and I watched my son sit down believing he'd just honored something real. Then Graham stood up, and the energy shifted in this subtle way that most people probably didn't notice. He introduced himself as an old friend from the Colorado development community, mentioned some projects that made him sound legitimate, and started his toast with all the right words about foundations and partnerships and building something that lasts. People nodded along, comfortable, expecting the usual wedding platitudes. He mentioned me in passing, said something about how I was probably somewhere thinking of my kids today and wishing them well, his voice warm and generous, and I heard Vanessa's breath catch on the audio feed, this tiny intake that said she hadn't expected grace. He talked about Kenneth stepping into not just a marriage but a family, a legacy, a structure that needs solid ground. Then he shifted, so smoothly it felt like the same speech, started talking about foundations and what happens when you build on sand instead of stone. He asked Kenneth how he'd managed to close those 3 dealership acquisitions in Phoenix during the downturn, said it was impressive timing, and the question hung there friendly but pointed. Kenneth smiled and said something about market opportunity and strategic positioning, words that didn't actually answer anything. Graham nodded like he was satisfied, then asked about the Copper Ridge project and how the investors were handling the permit delays. Kenneth's smile tightened just a fraction, and he said they were working through normal regulatory processes, nothing to worry about. Graham kept going, each question wrapped in admiration, asking about credit restructuring and timeline coincidences and why Kenneth's business partner from the Scottsdale deal wasn't at the wedding. The audience started shifting, phones coming out, people looking at each other with this slowly dawning realization that something was wrong. Vanessa's face went from confused to angry to panicked in about 30 seconds, and then she stood up, her chair scraping loud against the stone, her voice carrying across the terrace. The acoustics did their job, bouncing her words back from 3 different directions so it sounded like she was yelling from everywhere at once. Demanding to know who Graham even was, saying this was inappropriate. This was her wedding. Graham stayed calm, glass raised, told her he was just someone asking questions that good partners should be able to answer. Then he sat down, and the silence was enormous. Vanessa walked off the terrace, heels clicking, and Kenneth followed her, his face red, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, phones out and typing, searching Kenneth's name, and finding exactly what Nora had found: lawsuit filings, investor complaints, a Reddit thread from angry creditors. The wedding imploded in real time, not with an explosion, but with this slow collapse where the foundation just gave out. Nora kept recording, caught Vanessa in the hallway where she thought no one could hear, the acoustics delivering every word to the terrace. She was telling Kenneth he'd said this was handled, that the lawsuit was frivolous, and then she stopped mid-sentence, realized what was happening, pulled out her phone, and called me. I answered. Her voice was shaking, accusing me of sending Graham, of ruining this. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't ruined anything. I'd just let reality into a room she'd been keeping it out of. I told her life fell apart because she'd built it on a lie. Not my lie, but hers. She hung up. Within 6 hours, the toast video was on TikTok, then Twitter, then everywhere. Vanessa's face as Graham asked his questions, becoming a meme about denial and performance. Her real estate agency started getting calls, clients nervous about association, her reputation crumbling like Kenneth's business. The lawsuit against Kenneth went public 2 weeks later. Fraud charges, asset seizure, bankruptcy. Vanessa inherited his debts without meaning to, creditors coming after her because she'd co-signed loan documents before the wedding. Kenneth convincing her it was for their future together, and she'd trusted him the way she'd never trusted me. Ethan called me 6 weeks after the wedding, and his voice was different, smaller, younger, stripped of the performance. He apologized, said he didn't want to know. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about therapy, about learning to set boundaries, about realizing his mother had taught him to value image over substance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that's enough. Vanessa lost the house, downsized to a condo in Aurora. Her Instagram went quiet. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just kept living in Lisbon, walking to my favorite bookstore, having coffee at the same cafe every morning. That's where I met Sophia. She owned the bookstore, loved poetry, laughed at things that were actually funny instead of socially strategic. We started talking, then having dinner. Then she met Nora when she visited for Christmas, and they stayed up until 2 a.m. talking about books and photography and what it meant to build a real life. Ethan got engaged last month to a woman named Isabel who teaches elementary school and doesn't care about status or performance. He asked if they could have the wedding in Lisbon, something small and real, just family. I'm standing on my terrace right now, watching the light change over the water, and I'm not waiting for anything to collapse anymore. The ground under my feet is solid. I built it carefully, honestly, without shortcuts or lies. And for the first time in 15 years, I'm not performing for anyone. I'm just here. And that's enough. The real victory wasn't the collapsed wedding. It was building a life based on truth instead of performance. This story shows that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to participate in someone else's lie and letting natural consequences do the rest. When you stop performing and start living honestly, even if it costs you everything, you've already won. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.